Okay, so after our introductions for the STARLIMS architecture overview training today, I would like to state this will be approximately 30 minutes. I'm going to follow this up with a Menti, not a very long one, but it'll give you a brief light bulb kind of, oops, did he talk about that in the training, kind of an incident there, and then we'll be able to move on. The second part of today's training will have to do with the installation of the STARLIMS system, and we're going to take a short break between the two sessions. And I think we can probably cover this all in probably an hour and a half or so max. So if you'd like, please have your café con leches handy. So we're going to probably zoom pretty much through this. Since they're only 30 minutes long, we probably won't take a break in the middle of the session itself, the sessions, I should say. So without further ado, STARLIMS architecture overview. We're going to talk about identifying the components of the STARLIMS system. And we're also going to look at the training methods of interactive online presentation with this Q&A, and we're going to do it in about 30 minutes. And it's an introductory training topic with no actual requirements beforehand. We're going to talk about STARLIMS application servers, SDMS AA servers, which is STARLIMS document management system, and the advanced analytic products that are provided by STARLIMS. We're going to talk about the STARLIMS database servers, the cloud system versus the in-house system. We'll discuss the presentation layer, the business layer, the data access and storage layers. We'll talk about the STARLIMS databases, the dictionary versus the database. And we're going to talk a little bit about XFD technology versus the newer now V12 version over here, HTML version. And by the way, this is the first time I actually use a new feature that I know of anyway regarding how to highlight on the screen. Can you all see my mouse?
Yeah, we can see it.
Oh, I see. Maybe it wasn't necessary because I have this other thing that shows like a laser pointer now. It's red. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the application servers. In a basic single application server example, we have a standard Windows server. It operates on the Windows operating server software. And we have to have the Internet Information Service application loaded onto that application Windows server. The Internet Information Service hosts the STARLIMS configuration utility, which is an MMC, Microsoft Management Console utility. There are many different MMCs out there for every type of STARLIMS or regular application web server environment. And STARLIMS has its own MMC plugin, which allows us to configure and to set up all the different parameters and configuration settings for an application server associated with STARLIMS. From within the IIS environment, we'll be controlling the website application and the application pools, and also controlling the application server cache. There are different modes for the application server cache because there are different types of servers associated with the STARLIMS system, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We have different modes of operation in terms of server cache. We'll come back to that in a moment. So the STARLIMS application server, it hosts the actual STARLIMS web application. And these can be virtualized or either on a hardware machine or can be software virtualized to provide scalability and redundancy. The server contains the business layer logic, BLL, and it communicates with the client workstations via either HTTP or secure protocols. And it handles all of the data transactions between the web app server and the database server. Multiple application servers can be used to provide load balancing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But at a high level, load balancing has to do with limiting the amount of traffic that an individual machine is going to handle based on user load. And there are third-party application servers out there that handle load balancing, to which a STARLIMS server would be connected, or multiple STARLIMS servers would be connected. And that third-party application load balancer server handles all the traffic and disperses it evenly to handle traffic situations that might occur. So in a typical local hosted STARLIMS system, not a virtual system, we're going to be looking at this box right here. This is the application server. And it handles all of the communication between the database, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, and the client workstations. Now, this is a very simplistic look at how the system might be set up. In a true enterprise situation where it might have multiple routers, there might be multiple subnets, those folks over in the LAN world, they handle all of that. STARLIMS is agnostic as far as that's concerned. It really doesn't need to know about any of the stuff that happens outside of its walls and how it connects to the workstations. That's a different group altogether. LAN people do that. So this is a local-based web server, rather, I'm sorry. And this is handled in-house within an Active Directory, Microsoft Active Directory, and you've typically got administrative people that handle that kind of thing within the walls of a specific company. But STARLIMS also supplies a new tool called the web-hosted STARLIMS Cloud System. And they essentially host the server and the databases, and through an internet connection, they attach to the internal Microsoft Active Directory at a local client. So it can be handled virtually, thereby eliminating the need for a client to actually manage servers or own servers or do anything of the like. And they are definitely going towards this model now. Although there are a few folks out there that really feel they need to have total control over the application server, and they still host them internally. So the STARLIMS database really consists of two distinct database instances. One of them is called DICT. That's how it's pronounced and referenced. It's actually the dictionary. And then they also have what's called the data DB database. The dictionary hosts all of the application HTML forms, the .NET code behind the forms. That's written in the JScript language. It's proprietary to STARLIMS. And then it also hosts the STARLIMS scripting language. This is the server-side language, SSL. And we'll be talking more about this later. The database instance, that hosts the static data, the definition, for example, of tests, workflows, sample types, instruments, users, along those lines. But it also hosts the dynamic data, and that would be workflow-related data. Anytime a sample is accessioned, and forgive me, because the first time I heard the word accessioned, I wasn't a laboratory person. I was just basically a Python application developer and had never even heard a workflow term. So the word accession, and you'll hear that a lot interchangeably with folks saying sample receiving or creating a new sample in the system. It's also called accessioning. So anything related to an accession, which is a reception of a sample to which tests are assigned, to which workflows are assigned, and to which those results associated with those tests and testing and sampling, that's all dynamic data in STARLIMS, and that's all hosted within the database. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that later too. So here's a graphic. So you've got one Oracle or Microsoft database, and it's split into two components, the dict and the data. And here's another example of the presentation layer objects, the forms, the code behind, the data functions. That would be SQL queries associated with clicking a button, for example, when you've got a filter shown on the screen and it's got to go back to the database to execute that SQL query and return it back to the application. Server calls are there. Client scripts are there. And oops, I didn't mean to do that. Server-side objects also. The server scripts are there, manipulation of any data using STARLIMS scripting language. That's all done on the application server through the dictionary. Database query calls. We have worker processes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Worker processes at the high level is essentially a job that occurs in the background while you're operating the system, and you'll want to say, for example, you want to start a sample into a workflow that requires multiple steps. Well, there are instances in STARLIMS whereby we don't want to do that in one sitting, looking at the screen, processing each step manually. We can define that process as a worker process, and when you click on the screen, for example, then it goes off and does that job in an automated fashion, allowing you to go back and do other things while you're operating the system. So then we have, I already mentioned database query calls here, that's correct. And then we have user security, and this is where all of the user management occurs for logins, for privileges, roles, and site login. STARLIMS accommodates multiple sites or multiple laboratories, and there is a great deal of control about how users are defined such that it can access given labs or given roles within those labs, and that'll be part of a different training. On the data side, we have this, I spoke about this on the other page, was static data, data that remains constant. It's not part of the actual sample workflow. So for example, your test definitions or workflow definitions, sample types, the storage locations for samples, the storage container types. You've got tubes, containers, and boxes, and all sorts of things. Racks, for example, things like that. Refrigerators. Also, the organizations. So that I mentioned up here, for user sites and submitters, folks sending samples to STARLIMS, etc., and instruments. These are just a few, actually, of the other types of data that are considered to be static in the STARLIMS system. Additionally, the data side houses the dynamic data, and that's anything that is accumulated in terms of anything that is a sample workflow. So when the sample came in, the type of sample that came in, the tests that were assigned to it, the execution of those tests and the results that occur as a result of those tests, those are all dynamic, and they are unique to the system that is currently running the STARLIMS system for that client. So a brief introduction, we're not going to go over them in this training, but you'll see quite a bit of reference to the STARLIMS document management system, otherwise known as an SDMS system. And it has its own server, and it is configured, and there's training related to that functionality altogether. But at a high level, anytime that a STARLIMS workflow is in process, as these samples come in and as the results are applied, generally there are reports that are generated that must be associated with those samples for the life cycle of those samples. And so the SDMS system accommodates the need to store PDFs, for example, that are generated by instruments. They're also able to store anything related to technician certifications. You've got to have a certification to use a specific instrument, and if that certification expires, then it also allows the multiple instances of someone having had been previously certified to continue their certification process, and it stores all of that documentation. So they keep that out, they decided to keep that outside of the application server itself for STARLIMS. It's got its own world, SDMS server. We also have a new tool in STARLIMS called Advanced Analytics Server. It's been out a few years now. It is basically an offshoot of the Tableau server system, which is a third-party system available to be purchased by not just STARLIMS folks, but anyone else. They've got a very robust system that takes in data and creates real-time metrics and allows visualizations and bar charts and all sorts of different types of functionality. But with STARLIMS, they have a specific flavored version of it that allows that particular product to be displayed in the center pane in the dashboard of a STARLIMS system. So it enables live, for all intents and purposes, data to be evaluated and to be manipulated and pivoted, as you will, any different type of manipulation you might want to look at that provides real-time business layer updates to the end user. And that's provided by the Advanced Analytics system. It has its own server, and there's an entire system of roles management within that system, and there's also a designer specific to that system. We won't be talking about that in too much more detail in this training. So I already talked about the integral management for storage and retrieval of laboratory workflows for the STARLIMS document management system. It provides the capability to gather unstructured instrument data automatically. So instruments will typically output a PDF, and the SDMS system knows where that folder is if it's a shared folder, and it grabs those PDFs, and for lack of a better term, STARLIMS actually called their process a grabber. They have a grabber worker process that goes out and constantly polls that shared folder for new documentation being presented by the instruments. And it knows how to read through a PDF with blocks and codes and sections and extract data from the actual PDFs and import that directly into the STARLIMS system. And then we also have automated process of document cycling for recurring certifications and SOPs. We mentioned that previously. So the advanced analytics, we spoke a little bit about that already, but it provides powerful data analysis and presentation tools. I might be able to give you an example of what that looks like, but I know that I didn't include that into this presentation because I knew we weren't going to be talking about it much. It shows it right in the center dashboard, and it's fully customizable. So you can create any sort of different types of visualizations right in the center dashboard of the STARLIMS system. And that is affected by a design system. It's a separate application that is used to access the advanced analytics server, which connects to the STARLIMS data, allowing a fully customizable and designable environment. It has its own separate database and server, so it doesn't impact the STARLIMS processing bandwidth. And here's an example of how the STARLIMS and SDMS systems might look. So for advanced analytics, you have a typical workstation, and we'll see later on that on the left and right-hand sides of a STARLIMS system, you've got your navigation panes, and then an informational system in the center is where this advanced analytics dashboard is displayed. So it has its own server and database, and the STARLIMS application server over here talks back and forth with advanced analytics, and the client displays the advanced analytics data, and STARLIMS continues to operate on either side of the advanced analytics display. This is only in the instance where an advanced analytics server and system are installed at a client side. If there is no advanced analytics server, then what happens is we just have a standard dashboard for the center component of the STARLIMS system. STARLIMS uses the .NET framework. It's the technology infrastructure, and it forms the foundation on which the STARLIMS applications run. And it handles the presentation layer services. It handles the communication services. It handles the STARLIMS designer platform and the integrated IDE. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a training tomorrow. But suffice to say that STARLIMS is ultimately customizable. It also handles the STARLIMS bridge layer, which provides the extended JavaScript services and framework and HTML resources for the latest STARLIMS v12 product. So STARLIMS went through a little bit of a process in its infancy and through its maturity. And the reason we need to talk about this is because there are two components of the systems that are out there currently that we may, as consultants, we're going to have to deal with. So there are quite a few what are termed V11, version 11 products, which operated under the XFD, extensible forms in the older technology. And then the latest product, I would believe would be a version 12 and beyond, will be HTML5 technology. The biggest difference, the highest glaring difference, is that XFD required Internet Explorer under all circumstances. It was not able to operate inside of Chrome or Firefox or any of the other typical web browsers. They needed to move into the 20th century and move up to web browsers that were able to handle HTML5 technology, and that's why they essentially moved on to this V12 product to handle V12 HTML5 technology. So XFD was versions 10 and 11, and it really provided the ability to present XML data within a web browser, and in that case, it was only Internet Explorer. As of 2022, they're pretty much not pushing that at all. There are customers out there that still use it, that are basically in queue to be updated to a version 12 system, but we're going to encounter these out there still, and so we really do need to know about them still. And there are some components of those systems that we need to have in our toolboxes if we need to work with them. So XFD are provided within a proprietary IDE, the STARLIMS Designer. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that again tomorrow when we have the training for that. But the designer allows for visual design of forms and controls. It handles any of the STARLIMS JScript, JavaScript. It's proprietary to STARLIMS. It's very similar to any of the other typical third, fourth generation programming languages, but it has its own idiosyncrasies. The IDE has an industry standard look and feel. It looks pretty much like Visual Studio. It emulates the functionality in there. So if you're familiar with using that, for example, you'll have no problem using this. It also has IntelliSense. So as we're coding and adding code inside of there with functions and whatnot, using the dot as in .NET, we're going to get IntelliSense for functions, for controls, and for calls, server calls. This is what the designer looks like at the high level. So HTML5 came into the world, and STARLIMS needed to catch up, and we produced something at the time that was a kind of a bridge, and I'll use that term again because there is a specific tool that is installed on some STARLIMS systems, which allows the XFD system to, quote, bridge over to the HTML5 Sencha framework. STARLIMS uses V12 and beyond for the HTML5 Sencha framework tool, and it provides the ability for STARLIMS to run on any HTML5 compatible web browser. It removes the limitation of having to use STARLIMS with Internet Explorer. They also have the HTML5 development services are provided with the proprietary IDE, that's STARLIMS Designer. We're going to be looking at that. And it updates the capabilities of the design environment by providing additional controls and additional elements, and it gives it a completely new look and feel. It really does look nice. So it looks a little bit different as far as the appearance is concerned, but we also have this new category under, and I don't want to overwhelm you with anything that we're seeing on the screen, but as you get more acclimated to designing in STARLIMS, you'll have access to this designer tool. And under the applications, in the categories, we have a new section called HTML forms. So the XFD really has to do with the old XFD system, and there are now HTML categories for those types of forms, which is basically the main difference between what happens in the new designer and the old designer. We also have HTML5 controls. Well, that didn't look right. I know there's more to it than that. I'm going to pause recording here for a moment. Okay, so let's do a mentee. We have a mentee here. Set up. Okay, so if everybody would please go over to menti.com and enter this code, and I'll start the session here. All right, so let's see what we have here. I'm not hearing anybody in the background. Can you all see? I'm making an assumption you're able to hear.
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome. Okay, so the honest answer is that number 3 over here on the last one was actually correct, but so is this first one. So either answer number 2 or 4 are correct. That should have been a green check mark. So you're good, and I'll give you credit for it. I'm not sure why it's not forwarding on here. Okay, here we go. Question 2. Excellent. The 3 sides are client side, server side, and the database layer. The database and the dictionary. So the dictionary contains all of the forms, client-side scripts, server-side scripts, reports, and any of the static information related to the presentation of a STARLIMS system on a client's server and on their client's workstations. The database, you may recall, handles all of the static data, handles all of the dynamic workflow related data. They are kept on separate layers. That's correct. answer number 2, workflow process and dynamic data. So number 3 was kind of confusing because it does talk about dynamic data and client scripts and SQL queries, but the client scripts and SQL queries aren't part of the database. That's part of the dictionary. All right, so here comes the 5th question. I'm giving the answers away. Yes, so the dictionary contains anything related to the presentation layer, forms, client scripts, server-side scripts, reports, queries, any of the stuff that actually makes the system operate is contained in the dictionary, whereas the database, again, contains all of the dynamic workflow data, things like test definitions, sample definition types, workflow definitions, things like that. And don't worry if you're confused or if it just seems overwhelming. It will come with a little bit of experience using the system. It'll start to all make sense. All right, so that's the end of the Menti for this particular session having to do with the architecture. And if you would like to take a 5-minute break, we can get restarted at, let's say it's 11:46 right now, 9:46 your time. Yeah, it is 9:46 your time. Let's just say let's reconvene at 9:50. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. I'll get restarted in a minute. Okay, is everybody back?
I'm here.
So I guess let's say Jajit, are you there? I don't want to start unless everybody's back. I know Jordan's with us. Jose,
Yeah, I'm here too.
Laura,
Yeah, I'm here.
Maria Jose,
Yeah, I'm here.
and I know I heard Violeta before. I just didn't hear from Jajit.
Hey, I'm back.
Okay, you're back. No problem. I didn't want to be rude and start with somebody missing from the group. All right, so this has to do with the installation of the STARLIMS system. And, to be fair, I can't imagine being on your end looking at a STARLIMS system for the first time, for example, and absorbing, hey, you know what, we're going to be working in a LIMS system that's pretty complicated, and we're learning about sample workflows and laboratory processes and the business end of what it is that a LIMS system actually does, which is complicated enough. But then having to understand the nuts and bolts of operating the STARLIMS system and the installation process. You won't have to be dealing with this, quite honestly, you won't have to be dealing with this so often. Once you've got the architecture in your brain and you know how it works, you probably won't think about it too much. For sure, by the time you've come on to a STARLIMS project, 99% of the time, someone has already done it. Somebody's already installed the system, and you're being brought on to, for example, you're coming on to a client who has an issue with their STARLIMS system. And they want additional components or additional functionality. All of that installation componentry has already been done, so you won't have to worry about it. But to be prudent, it's important that you know how the process goes. So if there is an issue, for example, what you'll be doing is installing a V12 system on top of a V11 system. That is essentially a brand new installation. So you will be going through the process of installing new V12 systems. Pretty sure you're going to be doing that. But there's also the possibility you're going to be working with systems that are already installed. And so we're going to go over the installation process just to give you an idea of what it looks like. So STARLIMS installation. It's an introductory training topic with no requirements. And I want to make sure I'm still recording here. Or did I stop it? Oh, it's been recording this whole time. Okay, so I'll edit the silence out when I'm done. So in this training, we're going to review the hardware, the operating system, and the software components, the Windows server, the app server, the database server. We're going to review standard installation components and procedures for both the Windows app server and the database server. And we're going to identify the license types and assigning licenses to users and activating a STARLIMS installation. So we're going to look at the hardware, the OS, and the software components first. At the onset, the base system should consist of a hardware server that has 4 cores, 2.5 gig. You don't need to remember these numbers. They're available in the manual when you go to install them, but this is the overall view of the actual requirement, minimum requirements. So STARLIMS has a web app server. There's also a batch server which handles those automated functions. We have the database server, of course. That's an entire world unto itself for DBAs. And we have an SDMS server, which we talked about briefly in the previous discussion. There's also the advanced analytics server. And we're not going to talk about that too much right now because it's kind of rare right now to have one of those around. And if and when the time comes, we're going to go through, and there is a much more detailed training coming up related to the advanced analytics system. So we're not going to talk about that in this so much. So whenever you're installing a system or talking to a client about installing a system for STARLIMS, you really have to talk about what the expected workload is going to be. Are we talking about a mom and pop shop? Usually it's not them. STARLIMS is vastly too expensive to have a mom and pop shop. It's usually much larger laboratories or connected series of enterprise laboratories. Nonetheless, you have to consider the amount of work that's going to be done, and it doesn't necessarily revolve around how many users are on the system, but it could be a very focused type of workflow where instruments record all of the results and accept the samples, and they're put through these immense machines. I'm not sure if you've ever seen some of these machines that are out there. They're the size of a small minivan, some of them. They're amazing, actually. And they'll put in entire groups of racks and trays, and those machines process a whole lot of data, and it spits out to a shared folder, and then the SDMS system or some other system might be processing that information and pushing it to STARLIMS. And that happens on a 24/7 basis, and there might be multiples of those machines doing this. So the amount of traffic in terms of data that is going to be processed by the STARLIMS system really needs to be considered in terms of what hardware they're going to require on the STARLIMS side to handle that. And the entire topic of load balancing, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment here, comes into play, right? So at some point, even one big powerful application server requires multiple instances of additional servers to be installed and created, and the traffic needs to be managed by a load balancer. So I talked a little bit about that before, and you might run into those more often in the next trainings, and you also might run into this quite often in the clients that are starting to come on board with STARLIMS V12 systems. You should know that load balancing is not something you're going to have to manage. Typically, they've got a system administrator that's out there handling that third-party software, but you'll be coordinating with that I was going to say DBA, but it's a system administrator, an SA, to manage connectivity and IP addresses and instance names for the application servers that are being installed for STARLIMS. At the very least, though, you're going to have one server for the application and one server for the database. So for network considerations, you want to have at least 100 megabits, very least. 1 gig is preferred. You're going to want to have any firewalls or routers between the application server and database servers. Now, in a cloud instance, that's all handled by STARLIMS with their cloud offering. And we talked a little bit about this load balancer, depending on the number of transaction volumes that we're expecting. Then there's also the consideration for server redundancy, backup plans, any number of failover situations, and that's just for the application server. We also want to talk about redundancy and backup plans for redundancy on this database side. So you might have RAIDs or an array of independent drives that are handling, the possibility that you have a failover in an environment where you can't have a failure of any sort. So that's all handled typically by DBAs and by the system administrators for the client, but you need to know about them so that you can speak their language and lingo if there are issues related to database. So STARLIMS actually requires a Microsoft Windows server. It's very specific about that. It doesn't run on Linux or any other type of Apache server or anything like that. It's definitely a Microsoft Windows server. And you configure them with an instance of the Internet Information Services. I'm not sure how many folks on the call here actually are familiar with that component. If you're not a system administrator and work in Windows environments, you typically that service or that component exists, but it's definitely required by STARLIMS. We also have to have the .NET framework installed both on the workstations that are going to be utilizing STARLIMS and the server itself. So the latest clinical versions for Server 212, maybe there's Server 2019, I think, out there now, maybe, operating under .NET minimum of 4.5, and IIS is up there, I think, towards 10 or 11, so the minimum is 8++. Plus, and also ASP.NET 4.5. And you want to make sure you get installed onto a 64-bit machine. It allows for scalability. So the good news is typically anything related to the database, you're going to be coordinating very closely with a database administrator, and that's typically somebody, of course, is hired by the client that manages their database systems. Alternatively, you would be dealing with someone at STARLIMS in the cloud instance hosting environment. So those folks, database administrators, they handle the maintenance and the optimization tasks. So you're not required to be a DBA. It doesn't hurt to have that information in your head if you happen to have been trained to do that. And that always provides value-added components to your being a LIMS consultant, but it's not an absolute requirement. So for Microsoft SQL, there are, and the thing I didn't mention previously was that STARLIMS operates under either Oracle databases or Microsoft SQL databases. But for the Microsoft SQL database, the Enterprise Edition is required. And that is because of the fact that it allows additional functionality that is required to allow for redundancy and fail-safe, such as nightly indexing and or statistical maintenance. And it also allows for data encryption because we have HIPAA environments and high-tech regulations out there that require the safety and protection of critical data, patient data. So data encryption, it's a best practice policy in general, but the fact is you need the Enterprise Edition to run those. And I mentioned previously that a Windows Server administrator should probably perform the proper installation and configuration of the basic Windows Server in the OS. So we want to confirm that it presents a working desktop in standard configuration, before you even start installing STARLIMS. You run into any problems with the installation of Windows itself, it's only going to cause additional problems downstream when it comes time to install STARLIMS. So can you browse? Can you click? Are the folders being presented properly, etc.? Secondarily, you want to make sure Internet Information Service is installed properly, and it's got a properly functioning service that you can see under Task Manager. During the installation of IIS or the configuration of IIS, you would typically get these types of forms in the Windows Options and Features installation and configuration of a Windows machine. So again, this is something that is typically done when you've already come onto a client project. It's already been done. But there may be instances, for example, when installing a new version, V12, that you'll have to go in and perhaps with the assistance of, or if they have nobody to do it at the client site, be familiarized enough with it that you can do it yourself and configure IIS on a Windows server. I don't know for sure, but I believe that Asterix does provide Windows System Administration courses of some sort outside of the scope of this STARLIMS training here. So this is not STARLIMS specific, what we're looking at here on the screen. That is definitely Windows operating system specific and IIS in particular. So I always recommend that a qualified database server administrator be available to consider installing or configuring anything related to the databases. So the out-of-the-box STARLIMS system installation includes a data and dict database files, raw, starter files, if you will, and that has to be installed in order for the STARLIMS system to function at all. It must be verified during the database installation that basic accounts exist with sufficient privileges that can connect and execute the DML, DDL, DCL, and TCL statements. That's kind of database mumbo jumbo for folks in instructions that allow things like selecting data or inserting or deleting records updating, creating functions or altering tables, anything like that. And that has to be available within both the database and the dictionary instances for the user that's logged in. As you encounter additional customizations of STARLIMS, there are instances where you're going to need to go into the designer from where you will access the database and the dictionary records. And you might need to create additional fields, additional indexes, new tables altogether to handle new functionality. So you will have the necessity to go in there and make additional table changes as necessary within the database and dictionary. So we talked about this briefly in the architecture, but we're reviewing it here. STARLIMS contains two database instances, the database and the dictionary, known affectionately as data and dict. And both must be kept synchronized at all times. So STARLIMS does this automatically with its own internal services, but occasionally, and that'll be discussed more in the designer discussion and overview training, when a change is made to the STARLIMS system, let's say you add a new table for a new functional system that you're adding, that change is made in the designer in STARLIMS. STARLIMS knows about that change. STARLIMS knows about the table and records it in the dictionary. But that doesn't automatically mean that the database, the actual functional database server, knows about that change. And so there are functions within the designer that allow us to actually take that definition, that new definition, table, fields, indexes, whatever it might be, and push them to the database. So essentially what happens is by use of the designer, you are sheltered or kept away from the actual complexity of the database functionality required to do those things. So you can add a table, and you can modify a field, or add a field, delete a field, whatever it might be. You'll learn how to do that within the STARLIMS environment, which provides you a nice UI and provides feedback and immediate responses on the screen to indicate that something either worked or didn't work, as it were. You can all do that within the designer. So it shelters you and removes you from having to do it in the database. However, at times when you make changes, you got to push that update to the database, and there's a function in the designer that allows you to do that. You'll be trained on how to do that. So the database management system on where the STARLIMS system is installed, they must be centrally located and accessible to all the machines in a cluster network. So if you have multiple servers that are operating, for example, under a load balancer, and you've got multiple users located in different buildings that are operating across routers, et cetera, all of that is handled by a database manager or a system administrator. Again, you'll probably not be working so much with that, but you have to know about it. And if you have a situation whereby users from one building are able to access STARLIMS, and obviously another building, those users are having either intermittent problems or not able to get into STARLIMS at all, you can start looking at the SA or the DBA to start talking about how any routers or any systems between the two buildings or locations might be affecting the traffic. But at the very least, all the machines have to have access to the cluster network. And we're going to touch a little bit again on the data and the dictionary. So the database contains the actual business information like tests, analytes, results, anything related to both dynamic and static data. Static meaning the actual tests or analytes that are defined in the system, and the dynamic data being that which is associated with a sample workflow. Anything that's malleable or recordable in terms of the processes. The dictionary contains all of the forms, the screens, any of the code related to presentation layer type objects. So when installing STARLIMS, the installation package includes two blank databases for either Microsoft SQL or Oracle, and they contain the basic operating system and the basic dictionary for STARLIMS to present screens, to log into it, It won't have any tests defined in it because those are in the database, and we haven't defined any in a brand new installation. But all the forms are there, the systems to install a new test, to create a new test, the forms that come up and allow you to create one, or modify additional components of a test, the analytes associated, for example. It allows you to create new users. All of the forms and the databases, the forms and the tables associated with those systems are contained within the standard installation. I thought about this after the training, but this is important. I should have typed it in here in big bold letters. It's important for anyone related to a STARLIMS system as a consultant to understand that STARLIMS itself is really a toolbox. It's not a product like Microsoft Office or Microsoft Excel, for example. It's really a toolbox that allows you to create applications, and they happen to have provided a few applications for the different business and industry verticals that are out there. So they have a STARLIMS system on top of which sits for example, a forensics laboratory vertical, or a pharmaceutical vertical, or clinical science, or studies. These are all functionalities that have been built on top of the toolbox STARLIMS. So there's a clear distinction between what STARLIMS is and what it does. So you're going to be getting to know how to operate STARLIMS at the toolbox level. And then you're going to understand as you mature with your education and experience with STARLIMS that different versions of the software have been modified to create functionality specific to those industries. So there are folks out there that know quite a lot about the pharmaceutical and the forensic models, for example. But at the end of the day, you could work on either one. Because if you go to a client site for a pharmaceutical environment and open up the designer and start looking under the hood, you'll say, hey, wait a minute, these are all the same tables and the same fields and the same tools that are in the pharmaceutical as opposed to forensic model. So it's designed specifically to operate in different environments based on the need for a specific client, but the toolbox is always the same. Oracle has a little bit of a different scheme with their database naming convention, and schema names are more referencing an Oracle environment. I've not really heard schema being used with Microsoft SQL, but the STARLIMS system does require these two names, STARLIMS Dict and STARLIMS Data, referencing our two-part database system. So the database account needs to have members that associate with roles connecting to the database and connecting to tables and resources. And then the system also needs to be defined with an unlimited table space for STARLIMS. Database accounts must be able to execute stored procedures and user-defined functions. TNS names is a feature that's used only in Oracle databases, and it uses the Oracle Net Manager or other appropriate utilities. Again, this is mostly going to be handled by a DBA, and you'll be consulting with them. You won't need to know how to do it all, but you'll need to be able to speak their language. So talking about TNS names, which is a connection type string that is used in order to connect from a database server to the application server so that the two can talk and send information back and forth. Table spaces, again, are referencing an Oracle environment. And the two table
David?
spaces, yes, go ahead.
Can you repeat again TNS, please?
Yes, so TNS names is a component of an Oracle system that defines strings. There might be a path string of some sort with a server name involved in the middle of it, with an IP address that has perhaps a colon and the port number, to get down in the weeds discussing that. And that TNS name string can be given a physical name. So instead of typing in, for example, to connect from the application server to the database server, You wouldn't be putting in this big, long, ugly path with the name of the server and the IP address and all of the port number related to all that. It's given a name. So that name would be called, for example, STARLIMS data. And then that name, STARLIMS data, is used in the application server for STARLIMS to connect to the database, the Oracle database server, which also knows about that name. It hides, removes the complexity of the IP addressing and all of that.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. And this is something I haven't really run into too much. Most servers use the UTF-8 or the Alt32 character sets. But that, again, is usually done at the database level by a DBA. If they have a situation in STARLIMS where screens start coming back on the client workstations that have weird-looking data or characters that are not part of the language that they're trying to utilize the system in, it typically has to do with the character set that's been defined on the database server, or in some instances, the application server. So UTF-8 is a standard for the Unikit character set. When installing the database system accounts on STARLIMS application, you don't want to use the SA. SA is a standard that is used in almost every system that I've seen with either Oracle or Microsoft SQL, and it's all too well easy to try to hit that and start hacking at it. Eventually, some nefarious character might utilize that account to try to start banging away at it with an algorithm detector of some sort. So that goes by the wayside immediately if you stop using SA. So create a new account when creating an instance on database for the application server, and grant all of the DB owner privileges that would normally be part of SA to the new account. And it may be kind of detailish, and it'll all make sense later on, but avoid using a dash character in any of the SQL usernames. For SQL Server, also join the database accounts to the following roles. And a DBA will know what this is all about, but they may ask you what roles, for example, they need to connect their database accounts to. So you don't need to know how it works, just need to know that it works. They need to be DB_data reader, data writer, DDL admin, and security admin. You'll see these in the installation manual when you start going through the process. I've never had to go in there and honestly do all of this. So the other component is the DBA would have to have a grant execute command available to the person installing STARLIMS on the database side. So I know that was down in the weeds a little bit. It just merited having to discuss it. You, again, probably won't have to be dealing with that so much, and certainly during the installation, most of the database systems have already been created for you, and you'll be working closely with a DBA. So, moving on, the STARLIMS environments required for a healthy STARLIMS system usually involves 4 separate environments. The dev environment, that'll be all of the development work. It'll be a full STARLIMS system. Each one of these these environments, are indeed full operating STARLIMS systems, and they have specific purposes at a client. The development environment, the testing environment, Val for validation or QA for quality assurance, and the production environment. So these will be 4 servers, whether virtual or cloud-based or even hardware-based servers within a client. Typically, I've not seen in a while now 4 hardware servers. It's all cloud-based or virtual. And optionally, a training environment. That one I don't see too often. So they do not, STARLIMS does not recommend installing all of the environments on one server. Theoretically, you could. You could have one Microsoft Windows server with Internet information services installed on it, and 4 specific pools installed on that one machine, each handling its own application server. But that's not recommended at all. Obviously, it would just bog down the machine. And production environments, even if you go through virtual, they want you to have production environments be on their own machine, their own server. So during the installation of the app server, the following components are installed. The web application itself, the STARLIMS management console. I spoke this a little bit about this a little bit earlier in the architecture. There's the MMC, the management console, Microsoft Management Console. And what that thing does is it allows, let me go back to this one. What that thing does, it allows STARLIMS to be configured and manipulated in terms of server cache, in terms of connection strings to the database. It's an end user tool that allows that type of manipulation to occur. You don't have to go into the weeds and into folders and editing text files that the application uses. You may be familiar that in some web applications, if not most, they have a web config file. And that web config file hosts all of the information related to connections, users, paths. It may even have definitions for cache server folders, et cetera, on and on. Well, that you don't want to do that on a manual basis. So the STARLIMS Management Console allows that to be manipulated in a nice, friendly UI. STARLIMS Batch Manager service. So we haven't talked a lot about batch managers and those servers, but what those things do, they enable, for example, a STARLIMS sample might be received at the lab and the accession is started. And at that process, a batch manager server might recognize that the sample has arrived and automatically assigns tests, automatically assigns queuing for instruments to let the instruments know, hey, we received a sample and we're expected to send this over to you, and we're going to set a status on that sample indicating that it's been logged and or in process. So that machine, a batch server, handles all of that type of traffic. And it's a separate machine and configuration altogether. Additionally, not so much hardware printing these days, but because most instruments are outputting in terms of PDF and electronic soft forms for printing and reporting. But there are instances where a printer does need to operate, and so we'd actually install a print server type application service. And also the Crystal Reports runtime engine. This is a service that runs on the server and on the workstations. The server version of it generates the PDF output that gets stored onto shared folders, and the SDMS system can interact with that. Additionally, a Crystal Reports runtime engine component needs to be installed on client workstations such that when you click the print button or generate a report on the client, that it's able to actually create that render render that report on the screen. So these are some of the types of screens that are in the installation process. This is again the overview of the application installation. So there isn't going to be a great lot of detail about what's contained in all of these forms, but it does guide you in a wizard-like fashion from one step to the next. It asks you and prompts you for information as you're going. And once it's received all of that input, the final step would be to install, and off it goes with all the information you've given it. So an example is, I don't know if I can blow up here. So when installing the database, for example, and the dictionary components, you tell it the server name, the login type, and things like that. And then there's a database string down here. It's illegible in this screenshot, but at the end, it lets you test that connection. So all of these things have to be working prior to the actual installation occurring, otherwise the server won't install properly. Towards the end of the installation, you'll get a prompt to install the Crystal Report runtime engine. And even though they call it Crystal Viewer up here, it's actually the runtime engine. So talk a little bit more about load balancing, just to make that a little bit more solidified in your minds, because you'll be running into them a lot. Larger companies, enterprise companies, use load balancing machines for a number of different reasons. One, of course, to alleviate the load on any one application server. Also, it allows for system redundancy. As if there's any situation whereby a group of servers, a group of STARLIMS application servers fail for whatever reason, that the load balancer can detect that the failure occurred on that group and then flow all of the additional traffic attempting to get from those old boxes to the new side for redundancy purposes. And a load balancer controls all of that. So at the high level, load balancing refers to the method of distributing the STARLIMS network traffic across multiple application servers that share the same STARLIMS database. So a load balancer is a network appliance. It's similar to a server, but it monitors traffic and directs IP requests to specific servers. They can be configured to direct traffic automatically using built-in algorithms, or can be configured to direct traffic using user-defined methods. There's an entire science to managing and installing and running load balancers. And typically a system administrator is used to do that. Again, we typically don't have to do that, but we need to be able to speak their language if they start talking to us about it. So for every specific machine that will be used beneath a load balancer, we must go through the entire STARLIMS installation process. Now, there are instances whereby, working closely with a system administrator, you can have one application server. This occurs mostly in virtual environments, where you've gone through the process of installing STARLIMS. Then they can take it and they can do image caching or image replication and create multiple servers from that one base installation. So you wouldn't necessarily have to go through the same process for the installation on every one of the servers. However, the configuration using the MMC STARLIMS configuration tool has to be performed separately on each machine. STARLIMS uses a user log and a work path folder to manage any type of session logging information and logs for user errors, as it were. And that is a centralized location that each of the application servers must be configured to access. So that's the reason why you have to run the MMC on every single workstation that might be even virtualized or copied from a base workstation server. And those are controlled within the STARLIMS console using MMC. So client setup, there's a little bit we need to talk about that. Both you'll encounter Internet Explorer for STARLIMS v11 products, or any HTML5 compatible web browser for the v11.7 plus, actually v12. I didn't mention that before, but v11 started to cross the bridge between the XFD technology and the new HTML technology. We're going to talk about something called the bridge in a moment. So the configuration outline for workstations really boils down to these points here. You add a STARLIMS site to the Internet Explorer compatibility view. I don't have an instance of Internet Explorer running on my machine, so I'd show you that. I couldn't even get screenshots of that. But there is a setting within Tools Preferences in Internet Explorer that allows you to set for compatibility view. In order to install STARLIMS on a workstation, especially with the v11 products, you have to run multiple utilities. One is to establish the web URL needing to be added to the trusted site settings. And the Crystal Reports runtime module must be installed. We talked about that briefly before. That allows the workstation to actually display reports. It's not required to run STARLIMS, you can still run STARLIMS, but if you try to run a report within STARLIMS, then you might get either a failure or some sort of an error message. The other thing that happens within STARLIMS is that some folks attach barcode readers to their workstations, especially on a what's called a COW, cart on wheels. And what it is it's just basically a roller med cart with a computer and a screen on it, and they push this thing around to various areas of the lab, and it's connected wirelessly to a LAN in the network of the laboratory. And it has a barcode scanner on it, so they can actually take tubes which have barcodes printed on them, and that requires the 3 of 9 font. It seems kind of a strange name, but that's what it is. There's all sorts of different fonts that are out there for barcode readers. They only need the 3 of 9 for STARLIMS. Additionally, for client workstations, there is a utility that is installed called the Clear Client Cache utility. And it works similarly to what you would do in Chrome, going into settings and clearing the application cache and all that. But this is more specific to clearing just those components related to STARLIMS. Installing those utilities on the STARLIMS systems and clients and on servers occurs within the URLs of these forms that appear when you're installing the system. You can see them. So here we are talking about the situation whereby you have instances of STARLIMS servers that are actually 11.7, 11.8, and I think there might be a shadow version out there called 11.9, which were prerequisites to the full HTML5 v12 technology being released. They did want the HTML5 browsers to be used with the latter versions of version 11, but they couldn't get it to work without running this additional utility on every single workstation that required that functionality, and it's called the STARLIMS bridge. The official name is the HTML to XFD bridge, but during the installation for a v11.7 system or even v12, there will be an opportunity to install this HTML to XFD bridge utility. You'll encounter this. Once it's installed on any Windows system, this is a cutout of the lower right-hand system tray area of a Windows client workstation. You'll see this little nifty icon. And if you float on it, it'll come back with STARLIMS bridge and the version. So for any given instance of STARLIMS, if you're going to be attaching to a development environment from a client workstation, you need to install one version of the bridge for that environment alone, right in this area here. If you have an instance to connection to the production environment from that same workstation, it requires a reinstallation of the bridge, and you'll see the same singular icon. However, the machine will have registered both instances of STARLIMS, one for the dev environment, which will have an IP address here, and another one for the production environment or any other environments you may have. You don't need to know a whole lot about that. Here's the update path that they're talking about. I took this from a client site, so unfortunately I was not able to, I had to redact it, not able to show the entire path. But you'll have a path like this for each instance of the bridge that you install on a workstation, enabling that connection. What that does essentially is connect the XFD older technology and translates calls to a given control or a form that has been coded in the XFD syntax and converts that to the HTML5 browser, and the browser knows what to do with it at that point. The next step you might want to know about is the actual licensing structure for a given STARLIMS system. And we'll use just one at this point, for example, the development environment. When a brand new system is installed in STARLIMS, it comes with a 2 license installation, allowing 2 users to come in and one to define additional users that may need to use the system. However, only 2 at a time can use the system. So the license structure works such that it's a cumulative type thing. So you might have 10 or 15 people defined in the actual STARLIMS system, but if only 2 licenses are attached to that instance, only 2 of those people can be logged in at the same time. One would have to log out to allow another person, for example, to log in. And you can do that within the register.aspx link associated with the URL for the system that you're trying to manage. Once you go to register.aspx, you'll see this button down here, click to view your current licenses. When you click that button, you'll get this type of a function here, where it'll show how many types of licenses are installed, and we'll address that in a minute too. There are quite a few different types of licenses associated with STARLIMS. And you'll see the number in this area. Additional licenses are purchased through the client's particular STARLIMS sales representative. That's not something that we do as consultants. We might inform the client that, hey, by the way, we need more licenses for the additional users you have. And the issue is that STARLIMS only issues access to their sales team and or their what's called a Zendesk system. We're going to introduce that system to you. And the Zendesk system is the STARLIMS support system, essentially. You have to log in with an email and a password. And STARLIMS only provides 2 accounts per client. So you'd have to log in, or they'd have to provide us. In some instances, the client provides us with the username and login for the Zendesk system. But we would typically recommend to the client, you need to get in touch with your STARLIMS sales representative, and we need to have an additional 10 licenses for additional users. So licenses are not cumulative. So each additional license contains the total user count. So let's say last week they bought a license account for 4 people. So you have, for example, 2 that come with the system, and they bought an additional 4 licenses. So the total count would be 6. So what happens 3 weeks from now when they discover they need an additional 10 users? So they're going to need a total of 16. They don't buy a new 10 user license to add it on cumulatively to the existing system. They buy a new license altogether that has a 16-seat license, and it overwrites the old one. That's how it works. Once a new license key is purchased through the Zendesk system, it has to be activated. So I'll go through that process here in a moment. But the overall high view is that the Zendesk system is used to make a request for an additional seat license. It's validated through their sales system, and then they will send back a very long hash code that is plugged into STARLIMS in a specific location within the register.aspx link for the given instance that you're on. So I mentioned this before, each STARLIMS customer is provided 2 username and password combinations to allow access to the STARLIMS Zendesk system. That's actually done. They may need help doing that. So even though we won't be the ones doing it, they may request one of us to actually log onto the system with them, maybe through a shared screen session or just to provide instructions on how to do that. You log into the Zendesk system, providing one of the access IDs, and you navigate to the request activation key support section, and you follow the prompts for the service request ticket, speaking in the first person. So in the STARLIMS system, there is an installation key that's copied from and I'll show that to you in the next slides, it's copied from the actual screen in the register.aspx link, and it's pasted into the body of the license key request email in the Zendesk system, and you punch send, and then you wait. And sometimes they're fast, sometimes it takes 24 hours. At some point, they respond with an email in the Zendesk system that you open, and it opens up another link, and it gives you the actual activation key. So you take that key and you plug that into the software, and it updates the number of users to the agreed upon license purchase. Here's an example of how that works. So this is an outcut of the register.aspx screen, and we would show here the installation key, which is a hash key in this upper pane of the installation system. You'd copy that number out and you paste it into the Zendesk activation key request ticket. And off it goes. You send it off. Then they come back with an activation key in the Zendesk email. And we cut that out from the email and you paste it into the lower pane, the activation key section. And then you click activate. I didn't show the result of it. Again, we don't have any opportunity. At the time, anyway, we didn't have an opportunity to cut and paste to show this information, and it's kind of sensitive anyway. But you would say at this point, click the current license. After having activated, click the current license. And if you come back over to this other form that we were looking at earlier, well, let's not do that. There it is. That's the one I'm looking for. So here you would see the number increment after having applied the activation key. Okay. So there are multiple types of licenses that are offered by STARLIMS, and we don't need to necessarily know all of the details related to all of them, but suffice to say that the FCL type license, full concurrent user license is what that stands for, allows for a single seat user to access the system and do anything they need to do in the system, given the proper roles and privileges by the system administrator. So this is going to be your regular user, the number one type of license that is issued and used by any user that is either a lab tech, a manager, a supervisor, anybody in the STARLIMS system using the full functionality of the system. In some instances, we'll be using what's called a DCL, a data user license. And the data user license has to do mostly with third-party applications or instruments that need to access the STARLIMS system to do bidirectional processing of data. So some instruments send data to STARLIMS. STARLIMS needs to be waiting for it, and that connection requires a license. And so that's what we'd use a data user license for. A batch manager license is for one of these previously mentioned machines that process automated functions in the background that don't need to operate the system from the UI perspective, but need to have an established connection with the database so that the batch manager can operate and send instrument functionality or do additional workflow processing, not necessarily related to an instrument, but might take a sample, for example, and apply multiple tests to that sample automatically in the background, and then send that sample and partake it into analytes and different aliquots, that's small components of the sample, and fill up a 96 tray ELISA plate for whatever it might be. So that all is done by a batch manager, and that requires a specific kind of license in STARLIMS. STARLIMS offers 2 batch manager service licenses out of the box. They come with the software installation. However, there are other companies that require, and I've seen at least in some instances, 25 different batch servers that are operating at the same time and managing data workflows for 5 different types of machines going on at the same. It can become very complicated. But the batch manager license is its specific type of license. Come on now, don't do that. There we go. Name standard designer. So as consultants, we're going to be asked to go into STARLIMS systems and modify functionality or add new functionality or fix broken issues. It might be the specific component of an out-of-the-box component isn't working the way they designed it to work, or it needs to be working, etc. You need a specific type of license to do that, to go in and be a designer in STARLIMS. There are 2 types of licenses associated with designers. For the V11 systems, the XFD form designer is required in order to access that older technology. However, they have a newer license called the HTML5 Designer, which not only allows access to the XFD, but also allows access to the HTML5 components and forms. And these are separate licenses that are purchased separately. In some instances, the STARLIMS system is used on a mobile device, either an iPad or some sort of a mobile device, anything like that, that requires a connection either wirelessly, mostly wirelessly, to the system. And they recognize that as a separate appliance, if you will, and they require the user to have a special license for that. When using an advanced analytics system, we talked about that briefly before, that requires its own user license as well. For the advanced analytics designing system, there's a separate workstation that is used in order to design these visualizations and these bar graph type things that are displayed in the center dashboard of the STARLIMS system. Because STARLIMS actually has a professional services department that generates this type of work, and they do this type of design work, they actually want to be able to control how that works, right? So either you buy an advanced analytics builder license so that you can do it yourself, or you contract their professional services team to do it for you. So, if they've got people out there doing it on their own, they're actually quite honestly losing a little bit business there with the professional services side. So they want to make sure they make a little bit of money on selling licenses for folks that are going to be doing actual building of the advanced analytics products. There are others here that are randomly, really, I don't see them very often, to be honest. The Crystal Reports Developer Edition, we wouldn't be doing that. Customers typically have their own copy of Crystal Reports to design reports, excuse me. The SDMS system, we've talked about that before. That requires a license as well, or multiple licenses, depending on how many machines are out there serving data to and from the application in the database in STARLIMS software, STARLIMS data management system. And there are any number of third-party applications that are out there. Again, I haven't seen a lot of these stability studies or waters and power. I know there's quite a few interfaces out there for that kind of thing, but you probably won't be encountering these too often. Just suffice to know that there are specific licenses required from STARLIMS to allow that system to interface with STARLIMS. So in user licenses for users are assigned during the user creation in the user management module. So here we have, oh, look at this guy, David Pando. And he's a full concurrent user guy. It's an FCL type license. When clicking this box, you'll get a list of all the available type licenses in the system, and you select the appropriate one for the user. These other settings with regard to user definition and setup, that will be in a little bit more of a detailed training at some later point. Here's an example of a tool called the Features Users. And when licenses are installed for these named type licenses, or the STARLIMS Designer or Advanced Analytics Designer, etc., they appear in the STARLIMS system under this module called Features Users. You'd see them in here. And here we have an example of the XFD older technology license, which came with the system, 2 of them, allows developers to modify and correct forms and things in the old XFD system. The MHD, Mobile HTML Developer, I guess is what MHD stands for, D rather. There are 2 licenses that come with the system there. So these may sit out here for available use, but you actually have to assign them to specific users. So you could drag up and down, for example, in this area right here to show all users defined in the system. And then you would use these radio controls over here to move them across or back and forth and assign the users to specific license. Typically, we don't see more than 2 unless it's a company that actually does a lot of customization, in which case they usually have someone on board that may be very qualified, but they still require folks like Asterix consultants to come in and do some really heavy-duty lifting. And so you would have an instance here where one of the Asterix folks, like myself, for example, and then the client's specific developers there. If I work with a team, for example, say Ronel or Julio Duarte, who've been working closely with me on another project, for them to access the HTML development features in the designer, I'd have to actually unassign myself or request that the client's user be removed from the assigned list, and we'd add in one of the other two guys. So there's a little bit of balancing act that has to be done with regard to making sure that the person that needs access to the designer has been in fact assigned an MHD license. You may encounter that. So batch processes, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, in STARLIMS should be assigned a specific name. Batch 1, Batch 2, not like Dpando for David Pando or Jajit or whatever it might be, to allow for easier troubleshooting. And by troubleshooting, I mean when system errors occur in the STARLIMS system, the previously mentioned user logs folder that's been designated within the MMC, STARLIMS configuration system, that contains a series of files, text files. And for each user, one of those log files is created on a daily basis, date time-stamped. So let's say you have a problem with an automated process being controlled by a batch server. If you've given the batch server a user ID name of batch 1 or batch 2, the log file will show batch1.log. So you'll know that there is the batch file, and the error message and the logs associated with that batch processor are located within that file in the user logs folder. So that's why you want to use a name related specifically to the batch server that's operating that system. So batch servers actually need to use a full concurrent license. They don't need to, I'm sorry. They can use either the FCL, which is a full concurrent license, or data current license type. Either one of these two works. Most often, the DCL is used because of the fact that the FCL offers so much more functionality. You don't want to be allocating this overblown license over to a function that is automated and doesn't require access to the UI. And again, the STARLIMS systems automatically allocates a batch type license when a batch process launches from a batch server. And it gives you 2 batch licenses out of the box during the installation. For advanced analytics, it's important to know that one full concurrent license will be used to establish a communication, two-way communication between the STARLIMS app server and the advanced analytics app server. Because for all intents, STARLIMS sees an advanced analytic app server as a full-blown user sitting out in the world who's accessing the system, doing whatever it needs to do. Additionally, the advanced analytic app server produces output in the form of HTML and XML data shown in the center dashboard of the STARLIMS system. So for all intents, it is accessing the UI, so therefore it needs an FCL license. So this concludes the presentation. You're off the hook for a Menti exercise on this one. We literally ran out of time on it, but I'm sure that we're going to have one at some point, and this training will be available on a PDF, and it will be recorded. Obviously, it's being recorded, and will be available for review. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.